All right, welcome back. I hope you're enjoying yourself so far. Our next session is titled Data and Deal Making, using data to make a meaningful impact on your transactions. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the virtual stage. And I'll hand it over to Field, our moderator.
Patricia, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Well, hello, everybody. We got an all-star lineup. So excited for everybody listening in and joining us to kind of participate and hear the conversation that we're about to have. As Patricia mentioned, this is about deal making and data. As everybody kind of knows, data has become just a big central focus for a lot of different groups on how to use it, where to get it, and what to do with it. As I mentioned, we have an all-star lineup. We have Josh Harris, who's a vice president of strategy with Skanska. We have Clifton Harness, who's the CEO of TestFit. And we have Sam Green, who's a vice president of strategy with Alliant Capital. So I'll give each of them a quick chance to say hello and introduce themselves, starting with Josh.
Thank you so much, Field. I'm Josh Harris. I'm Vice President of Strategy for Skanska USA Commercial Development. We are high-rise mixed-use office and multifamily developers in major coastal markets in the United States, as well as have our sister companies in Europe that do the same business, as well as our large construction operation. Personally, I run essentially research and investment strategy, looking at markets, investment deals, and sort of other major questions about where we're going to build and go next.
Great, thank you. Clifton, if you could say hello.
Hi, my name is Clifton Harness, co-founder, CEO at TestFit Inc. We are a seed stage startup that has built parametric and algorithmic modeling tools for architects, real estate developers, and general contractors. And in 2020, our users collectively did about 4% of all of the apartment planning in the US.
Great. Sam?
I'm Sam Green. I'm Vice President of Strategy and Investor Relations at Alliant Capital. We are an affordable housing tax credit syndicator. We also work on affordable housing preservation, opportunity zone development, and broad affordable housing development. We are working on strategies to implement data to be more effective and produce better outcomes for the affordable housing community.
Great. And again, I'm Field Stern. I'm a managing director on the investments team with Redwood Capital Group, headquartered in Chicago. We're a market rate apartment buyer running two different investment strategies in the suburban workforce housing space and what I'll call the suburban core plus space. So 4 different backgrounds, 7 exciting questions. Let's get to the first one. So data. So the role of data in tech, playing and optimizing the feasibility of a deal. How are you guys taking the data and tech, combining it and kind of filtering it into your processes and decision making? Josh, let's start with you on this one.
All right, thank you. So and this is something that we've been increasingly doing since part of the reason I joined Skanska is to actually build our own data platforms, not be reliant simply on what we get from brokers. We are taking various sources for certainly things like Esri data on demographics, as well as market data from places like CoStar, as well as RealCap Analytics and some of the other providers, and sort of building our own platform. And basically for us, we try to validate our own investment assumptions and theses. I mean, we're obviously building out. So, we're talking about making a decision today. We invest our own capital for a project that won't deliver for several years, right? So we want to make sure we have a strong understanding of the underlying market trends, the capital market dynamics. So our main goal is to have our own platform and sort of not be reliant on what others may tell us, right? And I think that that's something that increasingly, both for our essentially for our internal processes, right? We have to have our own foresight knowledge that we can back up our own theses. And it's just not acceptable to say, well, we feel this is a good deal. Something the simplistic assertions that maybe worked well in the development industry are not going to cut it to get projects approved these days.
And Josh, one thing that I hear a lot of when I talk to some of my competitors, some of my peers and whatnot, is that everybody kind of wants to have an in-house robust research team, if you will. And I think it'd be helpful for the audience to understand on your team, how many folks do you have kind of targeted or allocated to helping scrub data, bring it in-house and kind of work through that?
Sure. So addition to myself, sort of as head of research and data and strategy, I do have one dedicated real estate analyst who works directly for me on he pretty much puts everything into the models, runs some of our GIS systems, et cetera. We also have a head of technology who kind of helps run the back end of it. In every single one of our development offices, we have 1 to 2 people that are sort of assigned the task of being sort of the local both user or puller of data, but also sort of the inputter. So it's, so I guess you could say that's 2 full-time counts plus borrowed allocated resources of a handful. And, and that's, frankly, that's something that is newer for us. And I think that, across the board, it's not, I should say that it's not just simply market type or investment data, but eventually the designs of the company are even more in the operational and some sort of, more efficiency data. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's more people who have a part of their allocation to spending time on this.
That's great. Thank you. Clifton, if you wouldn't mind kind of giving your opinion.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if optimization was part of the question, but getting data just out of plans. I mean, I deal in the part of the process with architects and developers at the very beginning, like before buildings are, stable, before they're even under construction. And oftentimes they're making decisions with gut feelings and with a track record, which I think is fine for a lot of people. But when we have a housing crisis and a lot of other issues that we're trying to solve in our society and in our country, we can't just rely on, design, bid, build the way that we did it in the 70s and the 80s. So moving forward, getting data to the surface, especially in deals, is incredibly important. And when I think about deals, again, I'm talking about just real estate development deals, not stabilized assets.
Sure.
And so by that measure, I mean, just revealing the data in and of itself is what we're doing right now. Buildings are very opaque in the planning process because the systems that architects use are rather terrible. And it's the software ecosystem. It's just lagging far behind everything else, I think. And I'll give one example. We learned that when you add bays to buildings, like it's just like a 5-foot bay that adds some windows to units. It actually increases your facade about 30% by area. So it's like one of the worst decisions you can make from a hard cost standpoint. But we didn't know that until we went in and actually understood the data.
I have a follow-up question for you after this, but I want Sam to give an opinion, and then I want to kind of talk about the different data that you versus Josh and maybe versus Sam are using.
Yeah. So I think in affordable housing, optimizing feasibility is a bit of a question of putting together government actors and private entities, whether you're working with a nonprofit developer or a for-profit developer. The issues tend to be around whether or not there's an available allocation, if you can get a 9% allocation for your deal, or if you're going to have to go with a non-competitive 4% deal. Optimization of whether or not that deal is going to work out has a lot more to do with timelines and an ability to pay your debt. The main concern in affordable housing, of course, is you don't want to have to endure any credit recapture or things like that. And so optimization comes a lot more down to, is there need for affordable housing where you're developing? And then 2, is the market strong enough such that affordable housing rents are going to be I guess so highly demanded that you really don't have to be concerned about low occupancy rates or anything like that. Now, that might sound like a pretty easy task to run up at below market rates, but there can be certain issues of where you're able to develop, whether that's because of NIMBYism or that's because of lack of land that you can get at a proper cost basis. And those are the kinds of questions that are a little bit more difficult in affordable housing that you might not get in market rate housing. And at least for our purposes, this might not be where we are, but where we're going, we're trying to use our internal database to get really solid ideas of what operating costs are going to be, and then use external data sources to figure out, what parts of cities we might be able to target to have deals that are more easily approved and more appealing to local housing authorities and other involved parties.
Absolutely. GIS is an excellent tool for that problem, Sam.
Yeah, and we do some mapping and
So maybe for the benefit of the audience, Josh, you touched on Real Capital Analytics, which really houses a lot of transactional data, right? Like sale comparables. You touched on CoStar, which really is just a behemoth of research, economic, rent forecasts, et cetera. I think you touched on Esri as well. We at Redwood play in that same space. We subscribe to all of the same data providers, with the exception of CoStar. We really want to join them. They are expensive, but from everybody that we talk to, they're worth every penny. So we're trying to figure out how we can allocate the appropriate budget to that. But Clifton, Sam, what type of data are you guys constantly looking at, right? Like for Josh and myself, it's population growth, it's population numbers, rent forecasts that are helping kind of substantiate some of our underwriting assumptions. What type of data, just for the audience, Clifton, are you really looking at? And the same question for you, Sam.
Yeah. So we are sort of in the opposite world where we create data. And we create algorithms that solve, like, for the most efficient parking garage possible, or the most effective use of this space to solve a unit mix, given developer constraints. I only want 2-bedroom units on corners, stuff like that. But what we've found incredibly important, at least over the last year, with our stick-built customers, optimizing for building efficiency. So basically your net areas versus your gross areas have become incredibly important just because of the cost of lumber. And we've been able to build some features that calculate that information in real time, as opposed to having it be asynchronous, where architect might take a couple of weeks to figure those metrics out. So that's where we're at, I think, in AEC, is simply just how do we create the data and keep it created consistently? Can we use the same algorithm every single time to tabulate the size of a building, so that way we know we have an apples to apples comparison? Like, we could get someone from BOMA in here and they'd probably say, well, there's all these other rules you need to follow about how you tabulate buildings. But the goal is to just have apples to apples with when we're comparing different buildings against each other, so we can make better investment decisions.
Sam, back to you.
Yeah, so we use CoStar, we use Reese. We might use a couple more providers. I work with those 2 providers. I also go pretty heavily into the census data, the American Community Survey. I look at some other pieces of data to find kind of pieces that might not be immediately relevant or might not make sense, but just the approach that I take is basically I try to come up with as many different data points as I can, whether it's how many hospitals are around a place, or how many schools are there, how many people are enrolled, what's the average graduating salary of the university in town. Not all those pieces of data are going to be relevant or useful, but for our internal purposes, I've created an algorithm that basically is a linear programming model of different factors that goes through and tries to figure out, is this feature important in this city? Is this feature important in this city? So you can kind of piece together what might be important and what might not be important. And an example I'll give is I think that a lot of developers try to look at something like what's the percentage of bachelor's degrees that a certain area might have. And at least what I found is, yes, that is a predictive analytic. It's an important piece, but for what we do, which is namely, we are looking for median family income growth. And that is kind of what governs how quickly rents can grow in affordable housing. While something like education levels in an area might be important and might be highly correlated to ultimately that growth, what's a better correlation and is highly covariant with education levels is just simply the growth of high wage jobs.
Yeah.
And that's super simple. And, you might conflate those two variables and then put too much weight on one or the other when, you only really need to use one of them because they're so covariant or they're so positively covariant.
And so just playing on that a little bit, one, I saw Clifton get real excited when he said linear programming model. And I started thinking back to my statistics class and getting somewhat of a nightmare. So we'll stay away from there for a second. But when you're talking about the weighting, how much are you guys spending time going into those weights and changing them and looking at the sensitivities around if you play with one weight versus the other? Are those kind of just you making those decisions? Do you have a larger team that's looking at the outputs and then kind of playing around?
I use an optimization package in Python to do that for me, try to get the highest overall correlation. And then I'll go through and I'll look through them and see if that makes any sense or not. Sometimes it'll just come up with answers that are clearly incorrect and you'll try to govern that. But other than that, once you start playing with your weights too much, you start just going back to the, okay, that's right. And, what's the point of using data if you're just going to throw out all the conclusions that it gives you?
Sure. So then
I know a guy. I feel like I got excited because I know a guy that did something like this, and he was doing it with Whole Foods, and he was doing it with rents. So it'd look like if there was a Whole Foods and if there was rents north of like $2.50, he's like, all right, I got to find a piece of land within a quarter mile of here. Like that was his investment thesis, and he arrived to it through linear.
There are a number. I don't have any off the top of my head. I should have looked them up, but there were some really bizarre. There was one where a really high concentration of people in the legal profession was bad for rent growth. And at first I thought, well, lawyers tend to be very argumentative, and maybe every time a lease renewal comes up, they're just arguing it down. But I asked our general counsel what she thought of it, and she said, well, areas that tend to have really high concentrations of people in the legal profession tend to be heavily like government towns. And so
interesting.
I knew that.
Are pretty fixed, and so rent growth is pretty difficult to achieve in places where your income growth is limited by government budgets.
Yeah,
and that makes more sense.
Yeah. Clifton, you've given one of my secrets away. Pre-COVID, I was traveling quite a bit for work, and so when I would be going to a market and I'd be going to a property that I wasn't familiar with, literally one of the first things I would do is Google the closest Whole Foods to kind of get a sense for demographics. Part of it was demographics, part of it was, can I get a good sandwich?
Yeah. It's the heuristic to end all heuristics.
You do something, you'd find a similar correlation with Starbucks as well.
Yeah.
In most markets. And interesting. I did a lot of both where I was born and my kind of early career was in Florida, and did a lot of development consulting work in Florida. And in Florida, you could very easily just simply watch the movements of Publix supermarkets. Sure. And I actually know that the Publix development, I know the Publix people very well. And I mean, what was great about them was they were very willing to open up a store. They would, at least don't quote me on this because this is a really old statement from somebody that who knows what they do these days, but they would say, well, we'll open up a store, and if it loses money for 5 years, that's fine, so long as because they know that they're going to have the store for 80 years, and they want to make sure to box out any competitor, which is how they got an almost monopoly. But I knew a lot of developers, especially home builders or apartment builders, that would sort of follow where Publix went, and they would just know if Publix thought it was a good idea, and they did deep demographic data scrubs, and they were looking at they knew how many rooftops equaled enough shopping center demand. I mean, I literally knew some apartment investors that was probably the extent of their data research, was sort of trying to track where this one tenant would go. And then I later learned more retailers actually did exactly the same things. Where do the Publix go? Then they send their site selectors, get me something that's on the same drive side as where the Publix would go. And it works. It's just interesting. You don't need any linear programming to do it.
This is why they know. This is why they know where people want to go, because they're tracking all of your movement. And
well, they were doing this even before the iPhone.
Google Maps did more for retail, I think, than Amazon did.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, it's true.
Is
actually,
that
one of the things
controversial statement.
Well, we're actually we have some subscriptions, somewhat what they're called more experimental data. We're going to want like something that takes social media data and is looking almost more of an advanced psychographic. So if you're familiar with, I know a lot of apartment people are going to be familiar with Esri and their tapestry demographic, which obviously can tell you, what type of apartment renter is. And I'm not going to for proprietary reasons, I won't say which one, but there's a certain Esri tapestry segment that really explains where Skanska apartments do great, and it's not hard to figure out what these are, but we're looking at some of these ones that are using social media check-ins or other data. And part of a big challenge, and this is something that I think probably everybody in the development game would love to have I don't think there's a perfect model for this. I'll just go ahead and answer that. I don't think it exists, but you can use data to get a little bit of to kind of check your gut. Is we always say, can we find the next Brooklyn before it becomes Brooklyn? Or if you look at a large market, can I identify the next Denver before it's Denver? Or maybe Nashville if you're talking in recent years. And I think that one of
that's what neural nets are great for, though, right?
Yeah,
let's track all the data that created this crazy growth, and then all right, can we spot some trends that are similar?
The trick, Clifton, I think, and that we sort of, I think, sort of as look, I come from a PhD background, economics background. It's always about where does lead lags, and it's always about indicators, right? Like what can happen in an area that gives you a geospatial trigger, but becomes before you say an increase in rents, or before you start seeing what maybe sometimes will later get categorized as gentrification or something of that nature that's easy to spot. And that's where I think I'm excited about some of the social media and some of these other newer data sources, because people, and frankly, and obviously this is maybe a little bit different than say like what Sam you might be looking at if you're primarily more in the affordable space, but because that might be more of a pure. In some way, the classic move for multifamily was all jobs, right? That was the thing, was jobs, which is still true. But the interesting thing is in more metropolitan cities, right, where your job is and where you live, there's trade-off effect. And one of the things that when you're getting into micro markets and some markets that, in some markets, people will literally want to live as close to their center of place of employment, so you can track employment, you can kind of know where the good spots are. But in some cities, people will prefer and pay more to live in these trendy, unique areas that are maybe more livable, maybe more walkable, maybe safer, maybe have a better set of retail and other amenities, and are fine with the commute to the office. And who knows in the post-COVID world where that preferential location dynamic is going to go, right? Because that's a consumer choice. In fact, if there's any big area that I would say is a huge, I think, missing gap for the apartment industry in general, is to the extent to which that we're in the consumer business, right? And we have all these consumers, and frankly, I don't know that we really get much information on the actual consumer dynamics of our own residents or of who's going on. And frankly, the one company like Amazon, frankly, they know probably with extreme personal precision what people are buying based all that stuff that's clogging up your hold room, right? That is. They have the best data probably on any set of any vector of residents in an area or in a building. But I don't know that any apartment group has ever done a great job at sort of getting into that kind of heavy demographic. Because we know, and I've certainly have seen this in any number of markets, that there's cool factor. I'm using a very highly technical term, cool factor, but there's a reason why some people live in an area, and even if they have to commute, even to a suburban office location, that cool factor at certain this is more for generally a younger demographic, right? Typically the the childless demographic, for lack of a better phrase. And then the minute you get into the childed demographic, then all of a sudden, then it gets very simple again. Go look at school quality and you'll answer all your questions, right? But there's a huge, a huge change there, right? About whether or not you're going to be looking at, because if the renters have children, you can map school quality and you probably will answer most of your questions. And school quality is perceptional, of course, but if you're dealing with the unchilded, which is still the bulk of renters in a lot of markets, and where I think a lot of people are looking to go, that's where it gets really tricky, because those people have a lot of options. And then transit, and that's, it's a fun challenge to try to solve. And I'll tell you, every single market, you have a different dynamic you got to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, look, as you were talking, I was thinking about the markets that we at Redwood cover, and Atlanta was the first market that came to mind, really, that makes sense for basically what you're chatting about. You started to get into kind of what the next question that I was going to pose was, which were kind of what improvements can be made to the way in which, multifamily operators, landlords, buyers, et cetera, can process and use the data. And look, I would agree with you. And I'll start with one comment, and I think I talked about this a little bit at the last time I was able to participate with a RETCON conference, but, just your simple lease audit, right? I mean, that is, it takes time, right? It takes resources to do that for your demographic, but you typically have a group that does it when they buy the deal. They may hold it for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. The likelihood of that group going back and doing it on an annual or quarterly basis isn't very high. And with a renter profile that's constantly turning every single year, trying to understand your demographic, which I would argue is one of the most important things, doesn't happen all that much. So, I guess the question is, what improvements do you think can be made? You touched on it a little bit, so I'll give, Sam a chance to chime in, and then Clifton.
So the question being, what can we do to better utilize, or what can the industry do to better utilize data? And you're talking about demographics. I think, well, part of that, I think, is fair housing. It's really tough to get, especially if you're not an operator, you're just at the LP level. What we do is we go by census tract data and just figure out the demographics from there, and just sort of just assume that our product is going to have a similar demographic as the tract itself. But that's also very important to us as, an affordable housing company, is we want to be serving those that most need service. And so, one thing I think we can do, and this is more of a policy comment than it is an underwriting comment, is we know from studies that outcomes are best for affordable housing tenants when those tenants, and specifically families, are allowed to live in wealthier neighborhoods. Now, part of the policy is that land costs are not included in your qualifying cost basis for affordable housing. And so land costs tend to be higher in wealthy areas. That's fairly obvious, but it also makes it difficult, not only from the NIMBY perspective. Wealthier neighborhoods generally don't want affordable housing in their neighborhoods. It's also, a problem in the actual acquisition of land. Even if you could get over the NIMBYism, it's hard to find something that's financially feasible for an affordable housing development. And so that's part of that is policy, but part of that is getting data to people that shows that, one, the people that are moving here to improve their lives and to improve their family lives, and two, housing values actually tend to rise faster than the median when affordable housing is nearby. And that is an odd conclusion that I don't think is I guess, immediately logical to people, but it's one that, if we can better use data and if we can better disseminate that data.
So I think you're saying, Sam, that vibrant communities are somehow more valuable than homogenous communities.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
But I have to say that one of the things, and this is, we use the census tract data as well, so I'm not going to say that like I'm doing something better. But one of the, especially when you're trying to go in and say build a new high-rise apartment or something like this, right? The depending on the city, the average of even a few blocks could be incredibly distorted when you have sort of something that's brand new Class A next to something that was built 50 years ago, or next to, maybe even government subsidized housing, right? So, I think that there is, and as I was thinking about this whole thing about your comment, Sam, about the sort of the mixed income demographics being the best for vibrancy or even values. I can remember when the master planning thing was huge, say back in the 2000s, which is kind of when I got into real estate. And there was this great moniker that so many of the developers would use, live, work, play. But the joke quickly became that if you could afford to, if you had to get a job there, because mostly service jobs, there's no chance you could afford to live there. If you lived there, there's no way you could afford to work there, right? So it was sort of it became almost a resort tourist destination, right, where the workers had to be bussed in, sometimes literally, or drive in, and that and then some of the ones that I was aware that some of those communities that actually were built closer to true urban development, more infill, which is tough to do because land cost didn't align for master plan so much there, did pretty well because you actually did have a much greater income gradient of potential housing and workers around the area. So you could actually have the vibrant downtown in your city center that frankly failed sometimes, at least in some of those initial ones that were done out in the suburban rings. So I think that those, if anyone wants proof of that, go look at some of the master plan areas that attempted this, and you can. I think you could see the point that Sam was making to be true pretty quickly in that dimension.
I'm not going to say the Woodlands, but the Woodlands is like kind of an example of like, it's a really thoughtfully well crafted master plan, but it doesn't feel as vibrant as it could have because it's very sterile in how it's organized. We spent a lot of time talking about like external factors that you would use to make decisions, but what about internal factors? Internal to the building itself is what I mean. Like when I was working in real estate development, we didn't have any semblance of a feedback loop. Well, we did. So tenant would complain about something to the leasing agent, who would then write it into a report that would then go to operations, and operations would sit on it, and operations eventually would then come to the design team and say, hey, like we think there's some problems here or there. Do you think we could change it? And you're about a year later by the time you learn that this specific problem with a specific unit plan you were designing exists. And you've already placed that unit in 2 other buildings that are under construction. So there's a feedback loop issue, I think, from the consumer to the development team. Another example of this is amenities. We're building way too many amenities, and it's a marketing gimmick more than it is a thing that really helps your tenants. And I can prove it because I went into our leasing agent or our leasing team, and I was like, hey, you have the Salto system, like, when doors are opening and closing. Can you tell me how many times the door to the conference room that we spent, I don't know, 70 grand on, like how often is this getting used? I mean, used like 8 times in 12 months. Like it's if you had that data, would you make a different decision? I'm not sure, because it's the marketing, thing that every developer does with the amenities. But you could make a more informed decision. Another thing is moving from CapEx into OpEx. Some things like we're going to build a gym here, but we're not going to add all of the machines, because what people really want is a yoga instructor to come in 3 times a week. I mean, having access to that data makes you a better operator, makes you a better developer, and frankly, makes you a better architect if you have access to that data. And it flummoxes me that there is not a dashboard inside every operations shop that shows how many people used the gym that day in 30 properties. We have no idea.
Does TestFit want to start building a dashboard for us?
Well, the issue is collecting the data. Like,
right.
I think the real question was, what improvements can be made to the ways multifamily dealmakers process data. Like, you actually have to have the data to process, and we don't really have it.
That's right.
So that's the first step. Like, I'd love to build it for you, but I don't have the data to build anything on top of.
That's right.
part of the challenge with the, I think obviously, the amenity war, which I think every market rate developer, I mean, depending on the city, is sort of, it becomes a sort of one-upsmanship about, I don't know which developer decided to fly to Las Vegas and see how many elements they could copy from the pools or the lobbies or whatever. But, it becomes this challenge that if you don't compete, then you're going to get tagged diminutive relatively. I mean, I always think that like you can always win with view corridors if you're building to height. You can always, location is always right. If you're right next to the train station and everybody else has to walk across an 8-lane highway or something like that, you can always win on those dimensions. But if you decide to skimp and say, boy, we don't really need that big of a gym, or no, we don't really need a pool because, we're in the Northeast and it's only gonna be open like 4 months anyway. The problem isn't you're the one that doesn't have a pool. And the problem, this even goes back to the hotel gym. I mean, I don't know how many of you ever passed.
Josh, balconies is by far a much better measure. In Texas, we have these outset balconies, 5 foot by 10 foot. And 10% of them have anything on it. Like, they're terrifying to go walk out on if you're 17 floors up. And we build all of them. It makes the buildings look better, I think, because you have something, but God, they're not used. Like, what?
But do they drive rents though? I think I'll go with the balcony as a good one, because in the office market, we have found, we were leading on this in some of our Skanska offices before. I mean, part of this, obviously, look, BOMA is saying that, a balcony becomes part of your rentable square footage in office helps all this. But like, we found that having tenant private balconies was such a huge, great for, and they do get used. Now, they're not crowded. Maybe there'll be more post-COVID, who knows? But, I always thought that the balconies on the apartment, just like the balcony on the cruise ship, for anybody back when people were willing to cram onto a small boat and cough on each other, something like back, 18 months ago. But I always thought the balcony, it's like opening the window. It's just that sense of freedom and escape. Yeah, I think it's funny you mentioned the last time, and it's been a while since I've rented I've been in an apartment renter myself, and like I had balconies, and I mean, okay, I can remember maybe with my my girlfriend, now my wife, we maybe had wine out there like twice, and it's like, but at the same time,
you're like sweeping off the cobwebs, like, nobody's been out here.
True, but to be honest, when I went to rent, if there wasn't a balcony, if it was just like a flat wall and some windows, I don't know that I mean, there was one that did have a balcony. I have to admit, I think it's like it hits a decision, even though it's the thought that it's there that, and it's a consumer choice dynamic, right? I mean, how many? All right.
But Josh, this is about data and deal making. We need the data. Like, we just don't know.
Clifton, are you going to stand? Here's the thing, Clifton. Are you going to stand in the leasing office? And when some tenant walks up and says, well, why don't you have a balcony? Or what happens? Well, data shows that you're only going to use this 2 days out of a year.
Okay, all right. So I went into our properties, and I was like, hey, leasing agent, can I go talk to the people that actually live here? Because I wanted to know like what they thought about the building. And you would not like it. It does not shock me that almost nobody had ever been asked, hey, could we make your unit plan design better? Like, nobody's ever asked that question. So they're always like, oh, I wish I had more closet space.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, look, one thing, sorry, go on, Josh.
I was gonna say, I said, if you asked, closet storage space would be the number one answer in almost every.
Well, we are Americans, so yeah.
Yeah. It's that Amazon stuff.
One thing that you're talking about, right? Like, does the resident want it or not, right? But like, take a step, before that. In order to build that development, unless you're building it on your own balance sheet, you need to go raise capital for it, right? Yep. So from the investor standpoint, whether or not the resident is going to use it, the investor is going to look at it and say, okay, every deal in this market has a pool. I need to have a pool. I'm not sure if it gets used or not, but I need to have a pool, right? The same thing with the buying mindset, right? If I'm going to buy a deal and every competing property has a basketball court and people are using it, well, gee, am I now going to get lower rents because I don't have a basketball court?
Isn't it the tanning bed though? You got to have the tanning bed because the other.
Look, the tanning bed is very important. I get that.
Yeah. It's
look,
an arms race. It's an arms race. I get it.
Podcasting studio.
That's right. Look, I mean, we go back, we buy a lot of 1980s and 1990s product. And, we are a firm believer that residents, unless you're over 6'2" or 6'3", residents don't walk into a unit, put their arm up and say, I am not renting this because it's not 9 feet tall ceilings. And that is a huge conversation that we have with partners about functional obsolescence and whether or not, being able to add washer dryers is one thing, but ceiling height, the majority of the demographic that's renting in the United States are probably not in 9-foot ceiling apartments. And they're fine and they're happy. And so we have these conversations a lot, not just about a pool or a balcony, but ceiling height and other sort of potential obsolescence that these projects have.
I mean, I will say, Field, something that I think very market specific. Like, I mean, I'm in my office in New York in the Empire State Building where we are here. And anybody knows about New York rental dynamics. I mean, people will rent closets, things that would be considered a closet in other markets for ungodly sums of money just because of the location, the fact that it's in Manhattan or parts of Brooklyn. So I think that one of the realities that we all contend with is that if supply is constrained enough, I mean, you could rent a flipped over canoe for $500 a month, right? I mean, on the side of the river, and you might get a waiting list for it because of demand. So I always think that
are we going to now start talking about how we're going to solve this housing crisis? We got to build 600,000 units a year, and we're barely, I don't even, maybe 300 this year or something.
We're lucky, yeah.
And all-time high lumber, it's crazy.
So we're getting kind of toward the tail end of our allocated time. I want to throw out maybe just another question that's on the list, and it revolves around kind of the implementation of data. And look, Clifton, you hit it on the head, right? In order to implement data and be able to kind of draw conclusions from it, you actually have to be able to collect it. And so taking kind of what was our first question and kind of tweaking it a little bit. What are ways that you guys think your individual companies can do a better job of, finding and aggregating the data and, even going so far as to go to the residents? Clifton, I think you brought up a great point, and I think it's worth having some conversation around it. So maybe I'll start with you, Clifton.
Yeah, I mean, not having access to, a portfolio of units that I could go query because I'm not in development anymore, not in operations anymore. It's kind of hard for me to get access to data. So what I would encourage development guys or architects or people that are really wanting to get better buildings from a data-driven standpoint, you got to IoT solutions have a lot of this stuff already built in. I use Salto as an example. They already have the data that you could use to make better decisions, but you just got to go ask for it or maybe demand it.
Can you share the name of that just for the audience to hear that again?
It's Salto. It's like the security key card thing that a lot of, so people want to enter the building.
Sure.
They press the thing, the door unlocks, it logs, this person came in, and the goal honestly would be to anonymize that data. You wouldn't want to actually know, track a very specific resident. You want to know the high level, people generally leave around 8. So maybe we should have our coffee bar ready to go around 8. It could be in a much more expensive demographic. Maybe they're getting up at 6:30 because they got personal trainer coming to the building.
Right.
So IoT solutions are a really great way to get that data. And then also I encourage people to send that data to the people that actually execute on the building design stuff.
Got it. Josh, what are your thoughts?
So this relates to data, but it's actually a little bit more of a systems process. But I feel like you would have to have the right data to pull this off. I think that a big missing component that not enough multifamily operators and developers think about is the fact that they are catering to consumers. They think too much real estate and they forget about how consumer behavior works. And they should go study hospitality. I already made one joke about going to look at the design elements of the Las Vegas pools, but We probably are missing service revenue and rent, either additional rent or literally marginal revenues from all of our units for us to provide levels of service that people are willing to pay $50 extra for the XYZ and different services. And I think apartments can differentiate themselves better. I mean, this does not work for all levels of companies, but or properties. But I think that we are probably leaving a lot of money on the table by honestly not thinking about what people are actually looking for in their total living solution, realizing that people spend a ton of time and thus a ton of money on their apartments. And we're fighting. And the minute an apartment developer thinks something about rent per square foot, you've lost the battle, in my own opinion.
And sorry, just a quick follow-up to that. Would you have a third-party service come and try and survey your residents? Would you have the on-site leasing team? Like how would you want to try and implement?
I think I honestly think that you have to integrate with your management company, and almost management companies that run like a hospitality company is I think going to be the future of this. And we've already seen with the pricing model, when the model switch began to have these the dynamic pricing and revenue management systems, which was essentially borrowed from the hotel and airline systems, right? That was already a step in the right direction. I think that you need to be very, some of this is that you have to just, I'm going to be a little bit like the Steve Jobs Apple thought, is that maybe people don't know what they want because they've never gotten it from their average apartments. And I think that somewhat you have to experiment with it, because a lot of this, if it doesn't work, you stop it. Like if you're paying a yoga instructor to come and nobody's showing up, you can, all right, yoga instructor, sorry, we're not hiring you back, right? You have to experiment with some of these items, but I think that that people are too afraid to recognize that they have consumer buyers in their buildings that have excess budgets. It's a profit model if you give them what they want, right? They will pay for you, and you'll make them happier because then they won't want to leave, right? This drives rents and retention. It's all very circular.
Disney World, they just are like all the data. They collect all the data. Where do people go? What are they doing? And then they analyze it, and they come up with a better plan on how they can distribute people across the park. They're tracking, where trash cans are, how quickly they fill up, when do they got to send a guy to go. The level of service at Disneyland, I think, or Disney World, is what we should be targeting for, at least in the highest end of the apartment buildings. I don't know, Sam, maybe these problems are not your problems.
I would argue, though, it works also in the medium range apartments too, and maybe even in affordable. I would not limit it.
Well,
Cam, I want to give you a chance to talk because we have a few minutes left.
Okay. Well, yeah. We don't have the same sort of profit motive. Like, we can't add a new amenity and charge $50 more a month. That's one. It's against the spirit of what we're doing, and legally we can't do that. So I think for us, it's more, we can go back, we've got data from over 100,000 units in 48 states. And, we can go through that and we can say, hey, this property, the, expense for electric is outside of our confidence interval for all the other properties. Let's go in and see if we can put in some LED light bulbs, or let's see if the air conditioner is too old, or whatever it is. And, we have that ability, and, frankly, we can probably do a better job of using that. And we're, in that process, but there are certainly ways that we can better incorporate the data that we already have into action.
Well, look, so one, let me just start by saying thank you to the three of you. Very healthy conversation, very interesting kind of thoughts that each of you guys have, coming from three different backgrounds. Having different opinions and whatnot. It was a very, very interesting conversation. I think if we were allocated another hour, we could easily blow through that and have a very fun conversation about some of the other questions that we were supposed to hit on and whatnot. But, Josh, Clifton, Sam, thank you all for your time. RETCON, we very much appreciate you guys having us. It was a wonderful time chatting with you all. And to everybody in the audience, thank you for watching us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, RETCON.
Thank you all. That was amazing. And I know this virtual audience is giving you a huge virtual round of applause. That was an awesome conversation, and we really appreciate you sharing your perspectives with us. And a special thank you to Field for moderating and asking such amazing questions. We really appreciate your time today. All right, for the audience, it's time for you to make your way to your next session. Along the way, make sure you accept your connection request and take some time to check out our amazing exhibits. Thanks so much, and we'll see you around.